Hello students, welcome back to another episode of Principles of Micro. Today we are in Chapter 5, looking at taxation. In the earlier episodes in this chapter, we looked at consumer and producer surplus. That's how I measured overall well-being. Now we know how to measure it, now we can look at how taxes will affect it. We'll start by talking about taxes on demand, then we'll switch to taxes on supply, and we'll see how elasticity affects our results. So we'll see in that section, there is a reason why the chapter on taxation follows a chapter on elasticity. They actually are linked. Lastly, look at subsidies, which are basically just negative taxes. So we'll look at, in this section, what's called a unit tax or a specific tax. That's where the amount of the tax is a fixed amount per unit. So things like 20 cents per gallon tax on gasoline. It's not quite exactly 20 cents. It's roughly 20 cents at the federal level. Or you tax each pack of cigarettes at some amount per pack. Those are unit taxes. Now, the other main kind of tax out there is called an ad valorem tax. So that just means it's a percentage. So many states have a sales tax where they pay 10% of the sales price. You also pay that in taxes on top of it. Those are ad valorem taxes. So in this class, Principles of Micro, we'll focus on unit taxes. Of course, ad valorem taxes are quite important as well. Sales taxes are a big part of everyday life. Now, the reason is that they are more complicated to analyze. That's why we save that discussion for my other class, Econ 445. But with unit taxes, things are easy to work with, so we can do that at the principles level. So a key idea is that tax places a wedge between the amount the consumer pays and the amount the pursuer gets. So let's say we're looking at a tax on the market for widgets. Maybe the price is $5. On top of that, our consumer is paying a $1 tax. So how much money comes out of the consumer's pocket? They're paying $5 for the widget, and they're also paying another $1 in taxes. From their point of view, the widget overall costs them $6 each. So that's how much money leaves the consumer's pocket. Now, out of that $6, only 5 of them end up in the producer's pocket. That's because the other $1 is transferred to the government. So that tax is a wedge, a gap between what the consumer is paying and what the producer is receiving. So this affects the graph. We have supply and demand. So looking at tax on demand, so supply is going to be the same supply curve it was before. So D0 is the original demand. That's the demand curve when there is no tax in place. If you add a tax, demand is going to shift back by the amount of the tax. So you can see here the gap between old demand and new demand, that gap, that wedge, is the tax. So P is price, P plus T is tax plus price. Thus, this distance must be the tax. So that's some intuition for what is going on. Now, what this means for welfare is that total surplus is going to go down. That's going to create an inefficiency, and that, by which I mean that total surplus is now no longer being maximized. So On the right over here, we see a market that has no tax in it. So you had consumer surplus being this triangle up here. We talked about that in the earlier episodes. P star is the market price, and you had producer surplus down here in this lower triangle. So those two triangles together was total surplus. Now if you add a tax, the story changes. So the consumer, their willingness to pay is given by the demand curve up here, D0. The price they effectively pay is P plus T. So they pay the price P to the firm, and they also pay the tax T to the government. So overall they're paying total P plus T. We know a consumer surplus is the gap between what the consumer was willing to pay, that is their demand curve, the gap between their demand curve and the price they actually pay. The price they actually pay is P plus T, which is over here. So that leaves us with this little triangle here for consumer surplus. You can see just visually that's a lot smaller than the consumer surplus triangle was back when there was no tax. Now, even though a tax is supposed to be on consumers, producers are affected as well. Actually, producers are also hurt by this tax. So producers used to get this big triangle here of producer surplus. Once you add a tax in there, then that triangle contracts. So because of the tax, consumers shifted back their demand curve. That's because they're paying not just the price, but they're also paying price plus tax. So they're less willing to buy now than they were earlier. So that shifted back demand, and that lowered overall prices. So P is now down here instead of being at P star like we had earlier. Producers are hurt by lower prices. Of course, all else equal, producers want to sell for a higher price than for a lower price. Producer surplus is the gap between what producers get and what they were willing to accept. If the price they're getting goes down, that's going to squeeze that producer surplus. So now that triangle is smaller than it was originally. So both consumer surplus and producer surplus went down. That means that total surplus went down. Now, part of the loss to consumers and producers went to the government. This purple rectangle here represents government revenue. I should say total government revenue. So the gap between P plus T, price plus tax, the gap between price plus tax and price is the tax. So this vertical distance here, the height of the rectangle, is the tax per unit. The base of the rectangle is the number of units. So tax per unit times number of units is total tax revenue. So this purple rectangle is how much money the government is getting. So while consumers and producers lost, the government gained. So it might seem at first glance just be some reshuffling of resources. However, there is actually more to the story than that. There's also this red triangle here. So this red triangle is an additional loss in welfare that is over and above what the government is collecting in revenue. So back earlier when there's no tax, that red triangle area, which would be somewhere around here, that used to be partly consumer surplus and partly producer surplus. When you put a tax in place though, now that area is nobody's surplus and absolutely no one is benefiting from that. What's going on? Well, you put a tax in place, consumers start buying less. So these transactions over here in this red region could have benefited both consumers and producers. Consumers' willingness to pay was up here at D0, their old demand curve. So they're willing to pay this much. Producers would have accepted this little, the amount given by their supply curve down here. So suppliers would have accepted a price that was less than what consumers were willing to pay. So if I'm willing to pay you $9 for a widget and you're willing to accept $7, if we trade at a price of $8, both of us are happy. Both of us get $1 of surplus from that. Unfortunately, if you put a tax of $5 in place on widgets, now that transaction is not going to happen. I'm not going to pay a $5 tax to get just $1 in surplus. That's not worthwhile. So consumers start buying less, and some mutually beneficial trades no longer happen. So that's an additional loss to surplus, an additional loss to society's welfare. So in other words, in order to get this revenue, shown here in purple, society had to lose the rectangle plus the triangle in surplus. That brings us to an important lesson. To raise $1 of tax revenue, the economy's got to sacrifice more than $1 of surplus. Now, this is not to say that you should never have taxes. That's not what I'm trying to get at here. You can have taxes, but the things you use the tax revenue for had better be really, really important, because it costs more than $1 to get $1 of revenue. So if it takes you, say, I don't know, $1.25 to get $1 revenue, then you better use that $1 revenue very, very wisely to make it overall a net benefit to society. So this red triangle here does have a name. That's called deadweight loss. Some books refer to it as excess burden. The name comes from that taxes impose a burden on society, and in this case with the triangle here, that burden is in excess of what the government receives in revenue, hence the name excess burden. However, I'd say the large majority of books and articles I've read prefer the term deadweight loss, so you'll probably see that instead. It's often abbreviated as DWL. So deadweight loss can come from taxes. However, deadweight loss can come from other sources as well, and we'll talk about some of those later on in this course. In general, it's whenever there's some kind of distortion, whenever there's some kind of inefficiency in the market, that can create deadweight loss. It can create a loss of social welfare, a reduction in consumer and producer surplus. So it's a very important idea. We'll come back to that a lot. So I talked about earlier in words how the tax on consumers reduces producer welfare, producer surplus, because consumers start buying less, and that drives down prices, and lower prices hurt the firms. Also, the lower quantity hurts the firms as well. They would have sold a quantity out here if there are no taxes. Once you put a tax in place, they're only selling this many units instead, and that's also cutting into their producer surplus. We all know the formula for a triangle's area, base times height over 2. Because prices went down, that means the height of the triangle goes down. Because quantity goes down, our base also goes down. If both base and height are contracting, then the area, the producer's surplus, is also contracting. So producers are harmed by a tax on consumers. By the same kind of logic, we'll see later on that tax on producers also harms consumers. Now, the real burden of the tax, even though it's supposed to be on consumers, is somewhat being borne, at least partly, by the producers. Now, in our graph, it looks like the producers pay a slight majority of the burden overall, but that's not always going to be true. We'll see later on in this chapter what determines who pays more. We can determine the real burden of the tax by comparing the prices paid and prices received to what the market price would have been. So the market price is P star. That's where supply meets demand in a market where we have no taxes. So you can put that price on our graph over here. So originally consumers are paying a price P star. When you put the tax in place, we said that prices fall because demand falls. Consumers are happy about that. Unfortunately, though, consumers don't just pay that price, they also pay the tax. So overall, consumers pay P plus T. So that amount is higher than what they were paying originally, P star. So maybe originally you're paying $7 for a widget. If you add a tax in place, maybe your price plus tax is now going to be $8, so you're paying $1 more effectively. So that gap between P plus T and P star is the amount that consumers effectively pay per unit. To continue my example, let's say prices were originally $7. When we put this tax in place, now they go down to $5. The tax is $3, so now the price plus tax is $8. So $3 tax, you might be thinking consumers pay $3 per unit. However, actually they're only paying $1 more effectively because prices fell by $2. If prices go down by 2, but you're paying a tax of 3, then effectively you're only paying $1 more. So that height over here, this distance between P star and P plus T, is the amount that consumers effectively pay per unit. Now they're purchasing Q units here. So that's given by where does the new demand curve, D1, where does the new demand curve meet supply. So they're buying this many units. So they buy Q units and they pay this gap per unit in taxes effectively. That means that the purple rectangle is the amount that consumers effectively pay. For producers, it's going to be the blue rectangle. They used to receive a price P star whenever they sold a unit. However, once you put this tax in place, consumers started buying less, demand fell. Because demand fell, producers had to lower price. So now price went down from P star to P. So even though the tax is supposed to be hitting consumers, the producers are being hit by it as well in the form of lower prices. So to keep going with my example I had before, prices used to be $7, but now due to the tax, prices fell to $5. Producers don't directly pay the government anything, but they are getting $2 less per unit because prices have gone down. So effectively, producers pay this much per unit. They're selling Q units, so this blue rectangle is the overall amount of the burden borne by the firms. And the red triangle is still deadweight loss. So we saw a tax on consumers also hurts producers, and this particular example just happened to work out that producers actually paid the majority of the tax that is supposed to be paid by consumers. So who the government says pays the tax and who economically actually bears the burden of the tax are not necessarily the same thing. That's one big takeaway from this episode. So that wraps up our section on taxes on demand. Be sure to tune in for our next episode in which we learn about taxes on supply.